What if the quietest voice held the loudest warning? In a world that praises appearances, how do we recognize real danger, especially when it hides behind kindness, credentials, and care? Today's story isn't just about Chuck Norris uncovering a hidden truth in a nursing home. It's about you, your instincts, your ability to notice what others ignore, and the power of choosing not to look away. Watch till the end for a lesson in awareness, influence, and quiet courage. If this resonates, like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. We'd love to hear your voice. The morning air was crisp, with early autumn stillness, the kind of quiet that wrapped around the bones and made everything feel a little slower, a little softer. Chuck Norris stepped out of the car and took a moment before closing the door. His hand rested briefly on the roof, eyes scanning the building ahead. Haven Hill's care facility. To most, it looked peaceful, even elegant. White-trimmed windows, ivy curling along the edge of the brick walls, and a garden out front that someone clearly spent time nurturing. But Chuck had learned a long time ago that appearances are often the last thing to trust. He wasn't here out of duty or guilt. He was here for an old friend, Walter. A man he'd once trusted with his life in places far less safe than this. They hadn't spoken much in recent years, life pulling them in different directions. But when Chuck got the message that Walter had suffered a minor stroke and was now recovering here, something tugged at him. Not an obligation, not even nostalgia, just a quiet instinct, a sense that the visit mattered. He walked through the main entrance. The scent of antiseptic met him first, mingled faintly with lavender, like someone had tried to soften the clinical with the familiar. The front desk nurse smiled, friendly but tired, and handed him a visitor badge without much fuss. Second floor, East Wing, room 214. The hallway was wide and bright, filled with the muffled hum of televisions and soft-voiced conversations behind closed doors. Wheelchairs rolled quietly over polished floors. A woman in a peach cardigan shuffled by, nodding slowly as Chuck passed. It felt calm. Room 214 was near the end of the hall. Chuck knocked gently before stepping in. Walter sat upright, supported by pillows, wearing a flannel robe and a lopsided grin. His eyes lit up when he saw Chuck. The two men didn't say much at first. Sometimes old friendships didn't need to. Chuck pulled a chair close, sat down, and let the silence settle. He took in the room. It was neat, too neat. No clutter, no photos, no signs of the man Walter had once been. Just a small radio on the nightstand and a faded photograph tucked into the corner of the mirror. Walter's daughter, maybe, or a memory from a different chapter. They spoke in low tones, about nothing and everything. The war, old habits, people they'd lost touch with. Walter's voice came and went in waves, worn thin from both time and medication. But his mind was still sharp, still in there, behind the tired eyes. Then came the soup. A quiet knock. The door opened halfway. A young nurse stepped in. Her uniform was clean, pressed, and pale blue. She had a tray in her hands and eyes that didn't match her smile. She moved with the practiced calm of someone who knew exactly where to step and how to avoid making noise. She set the tray down on the small overbed table and adjusted it gently toward Walter. Then she turned to Chuck. Her voice was polite, light. She said the kitchen made a fresh batch of barley vegetable, good for recovery, full of nutrients. Chuck nodded and thanked her. She smiled again. Then, just as she turned to go, she paused. She leaned in, so close he almost didn't catch it. Her voice was barely more than a breath. "Don't trust the facility director." And then she was gone. No explanation, no hesitation, no repeat. Chuck sat there, still for a long second. The words hit him in a way few things did these days. Not loud, not urgent, just deliberate. A message slipped into his hand like a secret note. He turned to Walter. The old man had dozed off again, the warmth of the room settling into his bones. Chuck stood and moved toward the window. The courtyard below was peaceful. Someone was tending to the roses. Another resident was reading quietly under a tree. But something didn't sit right. He looked back at the tray. The soup still steamed gently. The spoon rested in place, untouched. Nothing strange there. But the words wouldn't leave him. Don't trust the facility director. He tried to recall the nurse's name tag, but it had been tilted slightly. Mira, maybe. Or Mina. He couldn't be sure. Chuck had spent a lifetime learning how to read people, body language, micro-expressions, and the way she leaned in, the way her eyes flicked toward the hallway before she spoke. That wasn't theater, that was fear. Controlled, contained, but real. He left the room after a while, promising Walter he'd return in the evening. As he walked back down the hallway, he kept his pace steady, casual. But his mind was moving fast. He passed the front desk again, smiled at the same tired nurse, noticed two orderlies discussing something behind a half-closed office door. A janitor whistled off-key, pushing a cart toward the elevator. All routine, all ordinary. And yet, that sentence echoed in his head like a puzzle missing its pieces. Don't trust the facility director. He stopped by the visitor lounge, a quiet space near the elevators. A few residents were watching TV. One was dozing in a recliner. Chuck sat for a moment, pretending to scroll through his phone, but his eyes wandered. Looking, listening. There was a photo on the wall, black and white, probably from the 1950s. A group of nurses gathered around a smiling patient. A plaque beneath it read, Haven Hills, a tradition of compassion. Chuck exhaled slowly. He'd heard a lot of slogans in his life. This one didn't comfort him. He stood and made his way back to the parking lot. He wasn't leaving for the day, not really. Just stepping out to breathe, to clear his head, to remind himself that one quiet whisper could be the start of something far more dangerous. It wasn't panic. It wasn't paranoia. It was intuition. He had no proof, no reason to raise an alarm, just a woman's quiet warning, and the way it landed in his chest like a warning bell. Chuck looked back at the building once more before sliding into his car. He knew himself. When something felt off, it usually was, and when someone asked for help without using the word, he'd never been the kind of man to walk away. Not then, not now. The engine rumbled to life beneath his hand, but he didn't shift into gear. He sat there, watching the windows, the doors, the shape of a place that was meant to protect the most vulnerable. Something was wrong. He just didn't know what, yet. That night, the rain didn't fall, but the air hung heavy like it was waiting for something. Chuck lay on the narrow guest cot in the small visitors' room they had offered him. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't soothe but unsettled. He wasn't used to places like this. Controlled, polite, too structured to feel natural. Even in the military there had been an honesty to chaos. Here the silence felt curated. He had closed his eyes for maybe an hour, drifted in and out of shallow rest, when he heard it. Soft, muffled, a sound barely louder than breath. It wasn't coming from his room. It floated in from the hallway, so faint he could have missed it if he hadn't been trained to listen between the lines. It was the sound of someone crying. Not loud, not seeking attention. The kind of crying that comes from someone who's learned not to make noise when they hurt. Chuck sat up slowly, letting his body adjust to the shift. He didn't turn on the light, just opened the door, quiet and careful, letting the dim hallway spill in. The corridor was dimly lit. Most of the rooms were dark behind closed doors. He followed the sound, took slow steps, and breathed calmly. Halfway down the east wing, he saw a door slightly ajar. Not enough to look intentional, just enough to hint at forgetfulness. Or a warning. Room 228. The brass plate was dull, the name beneath it printed in thin, fading ink. Mrs. Klein. Chuck didn't enter. He stood just outside, listening. Inside, someone sniffled. Then silence. Then a sharp inhale, as like someone trying to hold it all in. He stepped closer. Through the narrow gap he could see the edge of a bed. The light inside the room was soft, like a nightlight. Enough to see, not enough to feel safe. Then she spoke. Not to him. Not even aloud. Just a whisper into the dark. "Why can't anyone hear me?" The words pierced through something deep. Chuck reached gently for the doorframe, just enough to make a sound. Not a threat, just presence. The crying stopped. He stepped back as he heard movement inside, the shuffle of sheets. The rhythm of fear is setting in. He didn't want to frighten her. He just wanted her to know someone had heard. At that moment, footsteps approached from the far end of the hallway, steady, soft-souled. He turned and saw her. The nurse from earlier. She didn't look surprised to see him there, just tired and a little scared. She didn't ask what he was doing. Instead, she glanced at the door, then back at him. Her voice was barely a breath. "You felt it too, didn't you?" Chuck gave the smallest nod. She looked around quickly and checked the hallway. Then she stepped closer, just enough so no one else could hear. "Meet me in the laundry room, 4 a.m., come alone." Before he could answer, she turned and walked away, her posture composed, like nothing had passed between them. He watched until she disappeared around the corner, then looked back at the half-closed door. Inside, Mrs. Klein had gone quiet again. Back in his room, Chuck sat on the edge of the cot. His mind replayed every detail. Mira's tone, her timing, the look in her eyes. This kind of fear only exists when someone has already tried and failed to speak up, but when silence is no longer a choice, but a consequence. He watched the clock. At 4 a.m., Haven Hills was a different place. The halls were empty, the lights dimmed even further. No music, no cleaning carts, no idle chatter at the nurse's station, just the hum of machines and the occasional whisper of footsteps. The laundry room was on the lower level. He followed the small signs past a set of locked offices and a break room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. He found it at the end of a narrow hallway, tucked behind a swinging door, the kind no one noticed unless they were meant to. Inside, the machines were quiet. Only one dryer rumbled faintly, its spin cycle echoing like a heartbeat. Mira was there, seated on an overturned laundry basket. She looked up when he entered, then nodded once. She got up and walked over to him. No greetings, no small talk. "What I told you earlier," she said. "I wasn't supposed to say anything, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore." She motioned for him to follow her to the far corner, where a stack of clean sheets created a kind of shield from view. She sat again. This time her shoulders sagged a little, like she was finally allowed to let go of the weight she carried. "I used to work upstairs, in the psych recovery wing," she said, "back when this place had actual rotation for mental health cases. It's different now. Everything's quiet, too quiet. Residents disappear from the system and nobody asks questions." Chuck said nothing. He just let her talk. "I started noticing the patterns. Patients who were lucid suddenly became confused. Some were over-medicated. Some signed documents they didn't remember signing. Then they'd be moved to another facility, or they'd just vanish. Their families were always told the same thing: decline in health, necessary transfer, end of life." Mira swallowed hard. Her hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles white. "There was a woman," she continued. "Her name was Linda Harrow, former accountant, sharp as a tack. She told me she didn't feel right. that her pills felt stronger than usual. She wanted to ask her daughter to review her finances, but the next day she was sedated and transferred, just like that. I tried to speak up, ask questions. Then suddenly my schedule changed. They moved me to the laundry, said it was temporary, that I needed to realign my energy. But I knew what it meant. Chuck leaned back slightly, absorbing every word. He'd heard stories like this before, always whispered, always dismissed as paranoid. But Mira didn't sound paranoid. She sounded exhausted. "Do you know who's behind it?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Everyone says it's Director Vale. He came in 2 years ago, right before the first incident. But I don't think he's working alone. He's the face, not the brain." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper. It was a printed copy of an internal shift log with several names highlighted. One was Mira's, another was a nurse who had been removed from rotation 6 months ago. She handed it to Chuck. "I think these people knew something, or saw something, and now they're gone." Chuck stared at the paper. He didn't know what he was looking for yet, but he could feel the shape of something bigger forming in the shadows. "I don't know who else to trust," Mira said. "Most people here just keep their heads down. They've seen what happens when you speak up." "What about Walter?" Chuck asked. "Has anyone tried to interfere with his care?" "Not yet," Mira said. "But now that you're here, they might start watching him too." Chuck folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. "Thank you," he said, "for not staying silent." She looked up at him, eyes tired but clear. "If I disappear, remember this. Watch for the ones who smile too much." He nodded, then turned and left the room, his footsteps quiet against the tile. Back in his cot, sleep didn't come. He stared at the ceiling until morning, his thoughts pacing. A quiet voice, a crying woman, a paper trail too thin to see in daylight. He knew one thing now: whatever was happening at Haven Hills wasn't just negligence. It was designed, and someone didn't want it uncovered. But someone else had finally asked for help. That was all he needed. Morning broke with a muted light creeping through the blinds, casting soft lines across the floor of Chuck's small room. He hadn't slept much, and what little rest he managed was restless and shallow. The conversation with Mira played over in his mind, not just in words but in tone, in the way her voice tightened when she spoke of those who had vanished. People didn't make up fear like that, not when the cost of speaking out was real. Chuck took his time getting dressed. His movements were calm and measured, but his thoughts were anything but. He'd faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield where the enemy wore a uniform. This was quiet, subtle. It wore a badge of trust and called itself care, and for the most vulnerable, that made it far more dangerous. He visited Walter first. The old man was awake, sitting upright, hands folded in his lap like he had done that 1,000 times before. His eyes were clearer today, more present. Chuck asked how he slept, how the food was, and if the nurses were treating him all right. Walter gave short answers, nothing dramatic, but he glanced toward the hallway twice, and each time his eyes held something guarded. Chuck didn't press. He knew when to let silence work. Instead, he promised he'd be back in the evening. Walter nodded slowly, as if he were glad Chuck was staying close. Back out in the hallway, Chuck noticed something. One of the framed pictures hanging between the rooms had been tilted slightly, just enough to seem out of place. He stopped in front of it and adjusted it with one hand, then scanned the corridor without turning his head. An orderly passed by, nodded politely, and kept walking, but Chuck saw the look in his eyes. Measured, curious. He made his way to the small break room, a modest space with a coffee machine and a fridge marked for staff only. Nobody questioned him. He poured himself a cup of bitter coffee and took a seat by the window. From there, he could see a small courtyard where 2 residents sat in silence, one knitting, the other staring into the distance. Nothing seemed wrong. That was what bothered him most. Later that morning, he crossed paths with Mira again, this time in the hallway near the medical storage room. She didn't speak, didn't break stride, but as she passed, she slipped something into the pocket of his jacket. He didn't look right away, just kept walking, turned a corner and ducked into an empty consultation room. Then he reached into the pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. There was no label, just a single note folded around it. It read, "3rd floor, maintenance office, left drawer, tomorrow." That was all. Chuck tucked it away. He didn't have a laptop with him, but he had someone who might help. Back in town there was a man named Owen, a retired tech analyst who owed Chuck a favor from years back. If anyone could pull data off a hospital-grade drive without triggering alarms, it was him. He waited until lunch to step outside, told the front desk he was taking a short break. The woman smiled and waved him off. Chuck drove 15 minutes to Owen's place, a small single-story home with ivy creeping over the eaves and a wind chime that tinkled even when there was no breeze. Owen greeted him with a raised eyebrow and a slow grin. He didn't ask questions, just led Chuck inside to a cluttered office that smelled like old books and soldering wires. Chuck handed him the drive and told him what little he knew. Owen nodded and set to work. While the files loaded, they sat in silence. Chuck watched a squirrel dart across the backyard fence. Owen finally spoke. Said the drive had logs, names, dates, medications. He pulled up one file and pointed to a column marked cognitive state. Next to several names, including Linda Harrow, was a sudden, unexplained drop. 1 week was lucid, and the next week there was a severe decline. Then reload. Another file showed a schedule of internal assessments. Every Friday, a meeting between Director Vale and someone listed only as JH. The initials meant nothing to Chuck yet, but something told him they would. Then Owen paused. He opened an encrypted folder near the end. Inside were scanned documents, power of attorney transfers, estate control notices, all signed under heavy sedation. Chuck felt a knot tighten in his chest. He took photos of everything, thanked Owen and promised they'd settle the favor another time. Back at Haven Hills, the day had shifted. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen had begun to ripple under the surface. Chuck walked the halls like any visitor, calm, familiar, forgettable. But now he saw things differently. The nurse who flinched when Vale passed by, the patient who smiled too much when asked how they were doing, the empty beds that changed names too quickly. Later that afternoon he visited Walter again. This time the old man seemed restless. His fingers tapped the blanket, his eyes wandered toward the door. Chuck asked if anyone had spoken to him alone. Walter hesitated, then said no, but his voice lacked conviction. Chuck sat with him a while longer, then stepped out for air. On the way down the hall, he paused near a nurse's station. One of the new names from the drive caught his eye on a chart. Julia Ramsey. He remembered Mira saying she was one of the first to notice the shifts. The chart listed her status as transferred. No forwarding info. He walked until he found Mira again. This time, in the linen closet. They talked in low tones, barely above whispers. He told her about the drive, the files, the forged documents. Mira said she wasn't surprised. She had heard rumors about residents signing over property they didn't know they had. One woman, she said, had a house in Maine. After 2 weeks on a new medication, she forgot it even existed. Then came the papers. Then came the transfer. Chuck asked about Jay. Mira looked uneasy, then said one name, Dr. John Harper. The medical director, publicly warm, privately untouchable, a man with no reprimands, no blemishes, the perfect ghost. That night, Chuck didn't sleep at Haven Hills. He said goodbye to Walter and told him to stay strong. Then he booked a room at a small motel 10 minutes away. It wasn't about comfort, it was about freedom. Freedom to move, to think, not to be watched. He spent hours going over the files, connecting names, matching times, building a pattern. He realized something important. This wasn't just about one man or one facility. It was a system, carefully designed, carefully hidden, and he was now inside it, whether they knew it or not. Thank you, said Monty, for doing what he did, and starting with the next morning, just before dawn, he returned to Haven Hills. There was something he needed to find. Third floor, maintenance office, left drawer. The third floor was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, not restful, not even calm, just empty. Chuck stepped off the elevator and paused, taking in the silence like a warning. Most of the resident rooms were on the lower levels. This floor consisted mostly of staff offices, storage and records. And on Sundays, especially this early, there wouldn't be much foot traffic. He moved with purpose, but without urgency. No reason to draw attention, even if there was no one watching. The maintenance office was near the far end of the hall, past a set of locked supply closets and an unused break room. He reached for the knob, found it unlocked and slipped inside. The office was small, functional. A desk, 2 metal cabinets and a corkboard filled with old service schedules and scribbled notes. Tools were neatly arranged on a pegboard. Nothing suspicious at first glance. But Chuck had never been one for first glances. He stepped around to the left side of the desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath a few loose receipts and a worn flashlight, was a folder. Plain, unlabeled. He opened it slowly. What he found made his chest tighten. Copies of patient forms. Some medical, some financial. Dozens of them. Each had been redacted in strange ways, with thick marker lines crossing out names but leaving dates and signatures visible. Some of those signatures matched the ones on the drive Owen had decrypted. The patterns were there again. Sudden medication changes, sign-offs on power of attorney. And one name appears in the margins of multiple documents. Dr. John Harper. Chuck's fingers tensed slightly as he flipped through the papers. These weren't just leftovers or misfiled records. This was a backup. Something someone had saved, either out of fear or conscience. And whoever it was, they'd trusted Mira enough to leave a breadcrumb trail behind. He took photos of every page, working quickly but carefully. When he was done, he returned the folder to its place. If someone was still using this drawer, they'd know if it had been disturbed. He left it just as he found it. Then he stepped back into the hallway, his heart still steady but his thoughts racing. Back on the second floor, Chuck made his way to Walter's room. The old man was sleeping. Peaceful. Or maybe just tired. Chuck stood there for a moment, watching his friend breathe. That slow, even rhythm. The one you never notice until you're afraid it might stop. He didn't stay long. Just enough to remind himself why this mattered. Why couldn't he walk away? Later that day, he requested a meeting with Director Vale. He didn't do it publicly. He asked a nurse at the front desk to relay the message, said he had some questions about future care options for Walter and wanted to speak directly. The nurse hesitated for a moment, then nodded and picked up the phone. Vale met him in his office an hour later. The room was modern, tasteful, heavy bookshelves, a subtle scent of cedar and expensive cologne. Vale stood as Chuck entered, smiling politely as he extended his hand. Chuck took it, firm but not aggressive, measured. Both men sat. Vale began with pleasantries. Asked about Walter's progress, thanked Chuck for being so involved. Then he shifted. He said Haven Hills took privacy very seriously. He said that any outside interest in records or staff behavior had to go through proper channels, and he smiled as he said it, but the edge in his voice wasn't lost on Chuck. Chuck leaned forward slightly, voice calm. He asked about Linda Harrow, about her sudden transfer, about Julia Ramsey, about a few others whose names didn't appear on the official resident board anymore. Vale's smile didn't fade, but his eyes narrowed. He said the decisions were medical. Some patients decline faster than others, so not every change requires a phone call to a distant relative or friend. He mentioned consent, paperwork, regulations. Then he added something else. He said Walter was doing well, but he was an older patient, vulnerable, and Haven Hills took that responsibility seriously. Chuck held his gaze, heard the message beneath the words. He stood, nodded once, and said he appreciated the director's time. He was almost at the door when Vale spoke again. Soft. Measured. Sometimes looking too closely at things creates the illusion that something is wrong. Be careful, Mr. Norris. Chuck didn't respond. He just left. Out in the hallway, he exhaled slowly. It wasn't just a warning, it was a line in the sand. He found Mira near the end of her shift. They didn't speak until they were in the back storage area surrounded by linens and locked cabinets. She asked how it went. Chuck said Vale knew more than he was showing, and he was starting to get careless. Mira's face changed. She looked down, then said someone had asked about her schedule. A supervisor mentioned transferring her to another department, overnight. She said she had to move fast. There was one more thing she hadn't told him. One of the patients, a man named Daniel Mendez, he'd been in room 306 before being moved last year. He'd worked in hospital administration before retiring. He was sharp, quiet. But one day he asked too many questions about billing statements and medication dosages. The next week, he was listed as unresponsive and moved to a long-term facility upstate. No records since. But she remembered something. He used to keep personal files on a portable hard drive. He said he didn't trust cloud storage, old habit. She didn't know where it ended up, but she knew which room it was in. Chuck nodded, told her he'd look into it that night. The room had been reassigned, but the old layout remained. Chuck waited until after hours, until the halls quieted and most of the staff retreated to break rooms or went home. He slipped into the room using a spare key Mira had managed to borrow. It was dark, but the light from the hallway gave him just enough to see. He searched methodically, drawer by drawer, closet, shelf, nothing. Then, in a box of miscellaneous supplies at the back of the closet, he found it. A small, black, external drive. No label, no cables. Just tucked under a pile of old brochures. He took it and left. Back at the motel, he plugged it in. It was encrypted, but not deeply. Owen had given him a few basic tools. After 20 minutes, the folders opened. Inside were detailed notes, daily logs, names, dosages, insurance claims, financial transfers, cross-checked against medication charts, highlighted anomalies. And then, a file labeled simply Harper. Chuck opened it. It wasn't just data. It was a collection. Articles, lawsuits, one dismissed, one sealed. A medical journal correction from 10 years ago that quietly removed Dr. Harper's name from a study on long-term sedation protocols. And then a note. Typed. Short. If I go missing, it's because I saw too much. This place is a farm. They grow compliance, and someone is collecting the harvest. Chuck sat back. The words chilled him. He saved copies to a clean flash drive, then locked the original back in his motel safe. The next morning, he returned to Haven Hills. He didn't check in. Didn't visit Walter. Not yet. He walked to the end of the hallway where the staff wing began. Then he turned and knocked once on the door labeled Medical Director. A quiet voice invited him in. Dr. John Harper looked up from his desk. Mid-50s, trim beard, glasses, the kind of presence that made people feel safe. Or invisible. He smiled when he saw Chuck. And then the real conversation began. Chuck stepped into Dr. Harper's office with the calmness of someone who had walked into danger before. The room was immaculate, almost too perfect. Shelves lined with awards and academic books, a clean white orchid in the corner, untouched. Everything about the space said control. Dr. Harper stood to greet him. His handshake was firm, but his eyes were calculating. He spoke with the smooth tone of someone who had practiced empathy, not lived it. Chuck thanked him for taking the time, said he had some questions about a few patients, particularly Walter. Harper nodded politely and gestured for him to sit. He leaned back in his chair like he had nothing to hide. Chuck kept his expression neutral. He started with small things: medications, standard procedures, who authorized certain shifts in care plans. Harper answered smoothly, like reading from a brochure, but Chuck noticed the small pause before every reply, as if the man was running mental diagnostics before speaking. Then Chuck brought up Linda Harrow. The name didn't seem to register, but Harper's posture shifted slightly. Then Julia Ramsey. That one hit something. His face didn't change, but his fingers tapped once on the desk, then stopped. Chuck pressed, just a little. Asked if he was aware of any unusual activity tied to those cases. Harper's tone stayed polite, but his eyes sharpened. He said everything at Haven Hills was documented. Those concerns were welcome, but accusations were dangerous. He smiled as he said it, like a man wrapping barbed wire in velvet. Chuck stood, thanked him again, said he'd be following up, then walked out. Outside, the hallway felt colder, not because of the air, because something had shifted. Harper hadn't denied anything directly, but Chuck had seen enough men lie to recognize the silence that followed a truth. That evening, Mira didn't show up for her shift. Chuck asked around. No one gave a clear answer. One person said she'd been moved to another wing. Another said she'd taken emergency leave. Her locker had been cleaned out. Her phone went straight to voicemail. That's when he knew things were accelerating. He checked the flash drive again that night, reviewed every line, every timestamp. He found something new. A string of notations in one folder labeled overrides. They matched dates on Harper's meeting schedule. Internal overrides, signed off under emergency care clauses. Every one of them is linked to a power of attorney change. Someone had designed a system where questions died before they were asked. He needed help, not the kind that knocked on doors, the kind that listened before acting. He contacted a friend, Karen Lynn, former investigator, now a private consultant. She knew how to trace financial irregularities faster than most banks. They met at a diner off the interstate. Chuck laid out what he had: the photos, the flash drive, the notes. She didn't speak much while reviewing it, just nodded. Then, finally, I looked up and said, this wasn't just unethical. It was criminal. Carefully layered to look like legal care, but it was exploitation. She said she'd start digging right away. In exchange, Chuck had to keep pressing from the inside. The next day, Walter was moved. No explanation, no warning. Chuck walked into his room and found a new patient there. He confronted a nurse. The woman looked shaken, said the order came from the top. Walter had been taken to a private wing for specialized monitoring. Chuck demanded to see him. I was told visitors weren't allowed in that area without clearance. The hallway leading there had a security badge lock. That wasn't standard procedure, not even close. He returned to the director's office, found the door closed, knocked once, no answer. He tried again, nothing. Then he heard voices behind the door, quiet, controlled. A third voice he didn't recognize. Then the sound of something being locked. Chuck didn't push, not yet. He stepped outside, found a bench by the garden, and sat. He needed to think. His phone buzzed. A voicemail. Unknown number, he played it. It was Mira. Her voice was shaky, rushed. She said she didn't have much time. She said that she was safe for now, but had to go dark. Then she paused and said 5 words that froze Chuck where he sat. He's not working alone. And the line went dead. He replayed it twice, just to be sure. Then he stood up and walked back inside. That night, he slipped back onto the restricted floor. He'd studied the shift changes, found a 20-minute window between rounds, used the stairwell, avoided the cameras. The hallway was dim and silent. He moved fast, checking door numbers. He found Walter in room B17. The man was awake but disoriented. His eyes opened wide when he saw Chuck. Relief mixed with something else. Fear. Chuck sat beside him and kept his voice low. Walter whispered that he'd been taken at night, no warning, said Harper visited him, asked strange questions. Then, I gave him something to help him sleep. But it didn't feel like sleep. It felt like falling. Chuck asked what else he remembered. Walter paused, then said one name. John. Not Harper. Another John. He described a tall man, cold eyes, no badge, said he was part of an advisory board, but he gave orders, real ones. Chuck filed it away, then helped Walter sit up, just to get his muscles moving again. He promised to get him out soon. As he left the room, he heard footsteps. He moved quickly down the hall and into a supply closet. Held his breath. A staffer passed by, unaware. When the coast was clear, Chuck exited and returned to his room unnoticed. The next morning, Haven Hills was buzzing. 2 patients had been moved again. Staff rotation was heavier, schedules updated without notice. Chuck played it normally, friendly, quiet, but inside his instincts were loud. He called Karen again. She had results. Financial documents showed a pattern of estate control transfers matching patients who'd been moved. Shell accounts. Out-of-state filings. One connection led to a private holding group run by a man named Jonathan Hale. Chuck recognized the initials. J. Haight. That afternoon he returned to Dr. Harper's office. This time he didn't knock. Harper was on the phone. He looked up, startled. Chuck closed the door behind him and stood there in silence. Harper recovered and asked if everything was all right. Chuck said no. He pulled the flash drive from his pocket, placed it on the desk, told Harper he knew about Hale, about the overrides, the estate transfers, the sedation protocols. Harper stayed calm, said none of it would hold in court, that Chuck had no authority here. Then he smiled. But that smile didn't last, because Chuck leaned in and said he wasn't alone. The people were watching now, outside the walls, and more importantly, inside. Harper's mask cracked for a second, his jaw clenched, his hand twitched. Then he said something that confirmed everything. If you keep pushing this, you won't just lose access, you'll cost your friend his life. Chuck didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Then he turned and walked out. He didn't stop at the front desk. He didn't check in with anyone. He went straight to the parking lot, got in his car, and made a single call. It was time to bring the right people in, and let the silence finally break. ChatGPT said. The next morning, the gates of Haven Hills didn't open with their usual quiet rhythm. They opened to flashing lights, clipped commands, and the unmistakable presence of people who didn't ask for permission. Unmarked cars rolled in first, then 2 cruisers, one plain van parked near the staff entrance, its side unmarked, but its intent unmistakable. This wasn't a routine inspection, it was a response, and it was long overdue. Chuck stood near the garden, leaning against a low stone wall. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable. He watched as federal agents stepped out, spoke to security, and began asking for records. The front desk nurse looked shaken, her hands trembling as she reached for the visitor logs. Behind her, a younger staff member quietly slipped out of view. He hadn't told anyone he made the call, not even Mira, not Walter, not Karen. Sometimes the moment you speak out loud is the moment the wrong people start listening. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. In this case, silence had been a shield, until the right voice was ready to speak for real. By 10 a.m., the facility director, Richard Vale, was in handcuffs. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. Just two agents walking him down the hallway, one gently gripping his elbow, while the other read charges in a low, steady voice. Staff watched in stunned silence. Some whispered, some stared. One nurse dropped the tray she was holding. Harper wasn't in his office. They found him in the back records room on a private call. He tried to play calm, to speak in measured tones, to assert authority, but the moment they mentioned federal fraud, something shifted in his eyes. Chuck had seen it before, the unraveling, that sharp flicker where control meets consequence. They led him out slowly, but no less firmly. As he passed by the second-floor landing, his eyes met Chuck's. No words were exchanged, just a look. Not of anger, not even of fear. Just disbelief. As if the man couldn't quite understand how the pieces had moved without him noticing. Down the hall, Walter sat in a wheelchair by the window. One of the younger nurses, the kind who actually looked people in the eye, was by his side. Chuck approached slowly. Walter looked up, and for the first time in days there was clarity behind his gaze. His mouth curved into the faintest smile. Chuck knelt beside him, resting one hand on the arm of the chair. "Told you you weren't invisible," he said gently. Walter gave a slow nod, then closed his eyes as if simply feeling the sun was enough now. Later, Mira returned. She'd stayed hidden until she saw the news reports. A coordinated investigation, state-level oversight, early interviews suggested multiple charges: exploitation, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy. She stepped into the front lobby like she'd never left. Her badge still worked. A few staff looked at her in surprise. One offered a quiet nod of respect. She found Chuck near the nurses' station. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him. Then, finally, I asked if it was over. He said it was beginning. She took a slow breath, then reached into her bag and handed him something. A folded slip of paper. The same one she'd given him the first day, now creased and worn. 5 words. "Don't trust the facility director." He folded it once and slipped it into his pocket. Chuck didn't stay for the rest. He knew when to step back. I knew when the work belonged to others. The lawyers, the families, the advocates who would come in with clipboards and policy changes. He respected them. But his role had been different, smaller, quieter, but no less necessary. Outside, the sun was warm, but not heavy. The air was still. Mira followed him out, her steps calm now. She asked what came next. He said he didn't know. But there were more places like Haven Hills, and maybe, just maybe, more people are waiting for someone to notice. Before they parted, she touched his arm lightly, said thank you, not loud, not grand, just honest. He nodded. A week later, Chuck returned to the facility, not as an investigator, not even as a visitor, just a man coming to see a friend. Walter was in a new room, brighter, near the garden. There were flowers on the nightstand, cards taped to the wall. One was from a granddaughter, another from someone in his old unit. Chuck sat beside him again. This time, they didn't talk much. Didn't need to. When it was time to go, Walter reached out and took Chuck's hand. His grip was firm, present. He held it for a beat longer than expected, then let go. On his way out, Chuck passed the lobby. Saw new faces behind the desk, a new director's nameplate. One nurse was humming softly while checking notes. The place felt different, not perfect, but changing. Outside, a light breeze stirred the trees. Chuck looked up, adjusted the cap on his head, and walked toward the parking lot. His phone buzzed. A message from Karen. New lead, new place, similar signatures. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at the building once more, at the lives still inside, at the stories still unfolding, and then, with a calm step forward, he got in his truck and drove away. He wasn't chasing trouble, he was listening for silence. Because sometimes the softest cry for help is the one that changes everything. Sometimes what changes everything isn't a grand act. It's noticing, it's listening when no one else does. It's that quiet moment when you trust your gut, even if nothing looks obviously wrong. Chuck didn't show up to be a hero, he simply paid attention, and because of that, lives were changed. Not through force or fame, but through presence, through care. For many of us, especially in this stage of life, we've learned that real influence often comes in subtle forms. A decision to speak up, a question was asked at the right time, a look that says, "I see you." That's the kind of presence that truly matters. And that's what we're all capable of. Whether you're leading a company, raising a family, or simply walking through your day with awareness, your presence carries weight. This story reminds us that the world doesn't always need noise. Sometimes someone needs to be willing to stay just long enough to see what others miss. Someone who believes that doing the right thing doesn't need permission. So, if this story stayed with you, if it made you think of someone who once looked at you a little too long, or maybe of a time you stayed silent when you could have acted, take a moment to reflect. Would you have noticed what Chuck did? And would you have stepped in? Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, or a time when you trusted your instinct and it made all the difference. Like this video if it spoke to something real in you. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories that move, remind, and matter. Because sometimes the smallest choice to care becomes the loudest voice in the room.